Governor Deal sheds light on his plan to rescue failing schools through state intervention. Has he now satisfied critics who've worried about government overreach? Uber is once again in a battle with taxi companies that want to see legislation to regulate the increasingly popular alternative to cabs. And Democratic Senator Vincent Fort responds to some of the key issues in this legislative session. Lawmakers starts now. Good evening and welcome to Lawmakers. I'm Bill Nigut. We're at day 14 of this year's legislative session. Governor Deal fleshes out his signature issue this year, failing schools, and how he'd like to see the state handle that problem. There are strong feelings on both sides of this issue. But before we dig in on the topic, our Pat St. Clair is back from the Capitol and joins us here in the studio to break down what happened today. Hi, Pat.
Hi, Bill. Nice to see you in person. Well, Governor Deal's push to have the state take over failing schools in Georgia began in earnest today when his floor leader, Senator Butch Miller, introduced the governor's Opportunity School District legislation. After that, the House and Senate Education Committees held a joint hearing. As written, the legislation would, for the first time, set up a statewide school district, giving the governor's office broad new powers. There would be a superintendent who reports directly to the governor rather than the State Department of Education. At today's hearing, officials from Tennessee and Louisiana talked about their experiences where similar takeovers have been tried. Paul Pastorak is the former state school superintendent for Louisiana, where he won high praise and sharp criticism for his attempts to turn failing schools around. He says their operating theory was to remove restrictions and barriers and to empower the new leaders of these schools.
Instead of using a traditional command and control management model of a local school district, where the superintendent hires principals, manages the hiring and firing of employees, directs the finances of the school, and manages the curriculum and instruction at a district level, the Recovery School District would instead delegate the responsibility over these three important functions to the leaders of the schools.
Nirav Kingsland is the former CEO of the nonprofit New Schools for New Orleans, most of which are charter schools. He says there has been measurable success.
I would say in layman's terms, we've gone from an F to a C. We've made incredible gains, but we're not there yet. The school system's not excellent, but I think our country would be a lot better off if many other cities that were struggling were able to see the gains we've seen.
The takeover of failing schools is a contentious issue. There are questions about what constitutes a failing school, how long the takeover would last, and of course, how all of this would be funded. Well, one person who asked the most questions at today's joint session was State Senator Vincent Fort, the Democratic Minority Whip. We had an extended conversation with Senator Fort today, beginning with his reaction to today's proposal from the governor.
I need to know more about the New Orleans model. I've been reading some stuff to say that the success of the New Orleans model is more marketing than substance. So I'm going to have to ask some questions. Second issue, the governor says we can do this without any more money. As a matter of fact, they take away from the schools 3% from each school's allocation. So, and then 3, this issue of what do you do, and because I can tell you that these 141 schools that they've identified, which we have not seen the list, but of the 140, I can bet you that they are in poor areas. Then I would submit to you that every child can learn, but that's no reason to ignore the impediments that children have to learning, like poverty, hunger, and health care.
Now, you said you have a strategy now.
Yes. Well, we're learning more and more about these takeover schemes and just where they work and where they don't work. And you can notice that Michigan is not in the room. I don't think that's a coincidence that, they're talking about Tennessee, which is only 2 years old, New Orleans, which may be more marketing than substance, but Michigan is not here at all. And we think because the Michigan model has been been an unmitigated disaster, it has not shown the improvement that was promised. So we're going to look at all of these models that we're being told to have confidence in, but more importantly than anything else, we're going to provide an alternative. The community school model says that you must not just teach a child in the classroom, but that if a child is hungry, that if a child is not feeling well, asthma, dental problems, those kinds of things, those problems have to be taken care of in the school. I am not confident that Governor Deal understands that. When I met with the governor's people, they said we'll deal with the poverty issue down the road. These children cannot wait until Governor Deal wants to deal with their issues down the road. We need to deal with issues like poverty and its impact on children and how they learn now, not later. That's why we're going to present a piece of legislation, an alternative to this takeover scheme. We're going to present a piece of legislation which calls for a pilot program in establishing a community school model where a child can get fed, he can get his health care taken care of, counseling, whatever it takes to make sure that those impediments don't prevent him from learning.
Senator Fort says the Democrats will present their education proposals next week. We'll be back with more from Senator Fort a bit later. And finally today, the Senate passed the supplemental budget after the Appropriations Committee made changes to the $21 billion spending plan. Now it's going back to the House for review. Bill, back to you.
So, Pat, what's interesting that I heard from Senator Fort in his conversation with you is they're not just going to try to tinker with the proposal that the governor's laying out. They're talking about a full-blown proposal of their own, it sounds like.
Yes, that's what he said. He said we'll get details on it next week, Monday in particular. In fact, we're going to talk Monday, so I can get some details from him about it. But he said it's comprehensive. And when I asked him about funding, he said, yeah, we'll take care of that too.
Okay, Pat St. Clair, thanks for that. I know we're going to have you back in the second half of the show with more from Senator Fort.
Right.
Thanks. So let's get to work in talking about this proposal the governor unveiled today. Joining us for that conversation, Liz Flowers, who is the executive director of the Georgia Senate Democratic Caucus, works with Vincent Fort in that role. She's also a media and government relations consultant. Leo Smith, the director of minority engagement for the Georgia Republican Party, and Greg Bluestein, political reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Greg, I think Pat asked the questions in her report that everybody's been asking. How long would a takeover last? What is the definition of a failing school? Those are the two big ones. Is the governor any closer to answering those after this joint hearing today?
Yeah, the legislation laid out those basic questions. A school would be in this recovery, this opportunity school district for a minimum of 5 years, a maximum of 10. And to be eligible for it, you'd have to be a failing school district, which is under 60 on basically what is the state's report card, for 3 years running, 3 consecutive years. That'd be about 140 schools, many of them in the Metro Atlanta area. There's about 60 of them in Metro Atlanta.
Okay, let's take a quick look at some of what the governor had to say about this. Put it up on the screen. Direct state management of schools, or possibly is it an option, sharing governance with a local board, convert to a charter school, or close the school. Leo, so the state puts all of those on the table as possible remedies given the situation in a particular school, yes?
Correct. And so you look at the situation in a school, and obviously the schools are in distress if they're at that level where they're 60 or below. And then you take a massive action for something that I think the governor looks at as a moral imperative, that, we can't continue to look at these schools in these kinds of situations, the children being impacted the way they're impacted, the economy being impacted because they can't contribute by having jobs when they get out of school. And you've got to do something to really to change this pattern. So giving people local control of the school, opening things up, giving flexibility so that innovation can take place in the school, including innovation like Saturday schools or having PTA meetings on Saturdays when some of these single parents might actually be more available to meet with it. So this kind of shaking the system up because we do believe in these children's future that much. I think this is pretty good leadership and vision from the governor.
Liz, and we're lucky to have you here tonight, really, because you're working on these issues in your job with the Senate Democratic Caucus. Is the main objection a concern about state intervention? And why a complete alternate proposal from Democrats? Is this proposal such that you can't tinker with it?
Well, what we agree is on one premise, which is the moral imperative to take care of these kids in these failing schools. What we don't agree on is the methodology and the way we're going to get there. Many Senate Democrats are looking at this as a sort of educational mirage in the desert. It's a shiny new toy with systems behind it that they're modeling after that have had large sums of money put towards them, and we're not going to follow that financial model in Georgia. In fact, what we're hearing from the governor's office is that he is going to take 3% out of each of these independent failing schools and put that towards the administration. What we've seen over the last 12 to 13 years is $8 billion in austerity cuts in our education system. We believe that there's a system there to be fixed. There is a financial model, as you've heard Senator Fort talk about. There's a community model. It's about examining the poverty in the area. It's examining a host of issues that include, that dump into, in fact, the education of a child.
Okay, I do need to follow up with you because I want to make sure I understood something you suggested here. Are you suggesting that rather than take money and apply it to these failing schools directly, that the governor should be raising funds for the entire system across the state? I'm not quite sure I understood that.
Sure, and what we've seen over the past few years from the governor is a modeled move towards charter schools. And while they are called nonprofits on their face, the fact is that there's a very for-profit enterprise behind them through the charter school management systems. So we've seen that pattern develop. We've seen the governor and his and the folks who are Republicans at the Capitol push this forward. We have not seen, in fact, the money, the finances put towards our public education system to fund it. And what we're now seeing, which runs contrary to what I've seen in the past with Republicans, is a giant state takeover using federal and state funds, which seems to run counter to their positions and philosophies.
Greg, you, as a reporter, have watched this unfold for quite a while now. So without regard to your political feelings on this, as a reporter, were some of the questions that you and your colleagues have been raising about this measure been answered by what the governor said today?
Yeah, the trigger mechanism, which schools will be eligible for a school takeover, if there's an exit strategy for some of these schools, and really the funding. I mean, the bill laid out 3%, up to 3% of the funding that would normally go to these schools would go to the administration. The governor's office says, the administration of this Opportunity School District, and the governor's office says that it shouldn't require additional funding, at least for the administrative portion of it. The big question, of course, is how it will fare in the legislature. And this is a big plan, a big risk for the governor. As a constitutional amendment, it requires 2/3 majority of both chambers. His previous big signature issues like criminal justice reform passed overwhelmingly. Something like this, though, is going to face a lot of opposition.
And Leo, Republicans are going to have to bring Democrats to the table on this, aren't they?
Well, I think everyone will be at the table for this who has a child in the school. Those people who are actually in urban districts, and largely a lot of African Americans who are struggling with these issues because of poverty and economic disparity. They're going to say, look, you can teach a man how to fish and, you know, he'll eat for a lifetime rather than giving him a fish. This education initiative is about teaching people lifelong skills.
Real last quick question on that, though, before we move on. That sounds good. It sounds correct. But are there other incentives the governor's going to have to offer Democrats to get him in the fold as far as you're concerned?
Well, politics is always about give and take. And I think that with everyone throwing all these ideas about education on the table, including the Democrats coming up with their proposal, I guess in a couple of weeks we'll see what their response is. But, you know, everything's going to have to be focused on results.
Okay. Actually, we're going to see it next week, according to Liz and to Vincent Fort. Let's move on. Another big initiative of the governor's, of course, needing, or not his initiative, but he's behind the initiative to raise more than $1 billion to take care of transportation infrastructure needs in this state. There's a big proposal out there for a new way to fund that. And today, a real fly in the wheel, I mean, a real monkey wrench in the works. Yes, Greg? What did Grover Norquist What did Norquist and his group do today?
This was Grover Norquist helms an anti-tax group that holds a lot of sway with Republicans, and it came out forcefully against the Georgia's plan to raise more revenue for transportation as a tax increase. And the reason why that's important is more than 24 Georgia lawmakers signed his no tax pledge, and they're going to hear from it if they end up supporting this legislation.
So, Leo, I got to go to you first on this. I mean, Norquist do you think it's appropriate of him to be coming down, reaching into Georgia? He's a Republican. He's got Republicans on board with him. Right. Is he causing problems for your party with this?
Well, I mean, I think he is creating a question that's important to Republicans. I mean, when is it appropriate? And I think Georgians have to make this decision for themselves. Obviously, Grover Norquist is a tax strategist, and he's finding relevance in what's happening here. But when it all comes down to it, Georgians have to decide, is this the time where we have to bite the bullet on a tax issue?
But Grover Norquist is black or he is white. He is a 0 or he's a 1 in computer language, right, Liz? In other words, it's a tax increase, and that's all there is to it. We oppose it. There is no room for saying some revenues are necessary, some revenue increases.
Well, and that's, I think, the trouble with this. Legislators are elected in order to represent their constituencies and their districts, and they need to have the freedom to make the best decisions they can. And what Grover Norquist is doing is tying their hands to make those best decisions.
This is highlighting an ongoing rift within the Republican Party as well, because there are something like 30-something Republican governors. 8 or 9 of them are now embracing some sort of tax increase. And in Georgia, you've got the same situation coming. Whether it's a tax increase or a revenue raise or however it's termed, Republicans are going to have to figure out how to couch this to their voters and to supporters like Grover Norquist.
Well, and that's the point. He hasn't made life easier for the Republicans down there who may feel this is something they have to vote for, right? Okay. Look, we are going to keep moving on here because we have a lot to cover tonight. As Pat St. Clair mentioned in her Capitol report, the Senate passed an amended supplemental budget this morning. Here's some of the action from the floor as that bill was debated.
Governor Deal has, I think, included funds in this amended budget for some very critically important programs. They're important to the economic development of the state and important to the safety and security of children in Georgia, and important to the continued judicial reform, the pathway that we've begun there. And they provide funds, the vital funds that we need to fund the growth in our K-12 educational system and the teacher pay scale for this year.
We talk about $1 billion, $1.5 billion needed for transportation, and we talk this session about education, that we will have a commission to look at the funding in the future. The fact is that we are over $747 million short of where we need to be. The governor talked in his State of State a year ago, I believe, about 9,000 fewer teachers. We know that it would cost $450 million to get those people back in the system and close our teacher student ratio to where it was previously supposed to be. We have to be addressing those issues, and we have to reflect on those issues as we move forward with each budget.
Senators debating the supplemental budget bill today. That budget did pass. The Senate Appropriations Committee made some changes, so of course it goes to the House, and they'll look it over at this point now. Still ahead on the Lawmakers, we have more with Senator Vincent Fort as he lays some more of his political cards on the table for us. We'll be right back. Nathan Deal is only the 4th Georgia governor to officially identify himself as a member of the Republican Party. By contrast, there have been 38 Democratic governors, 15 who called themselves Democratic Republicans, and a dozen who were members of the Whig Party. Welcome back to Lawmakers. I'm Bill Nigut. Before we move on, I want to bring back Pat St. Clair. It's so great to have you right here in the studio. I know you've got more for us from your conversation with Senator Vincent Fort. So please go ahead.
All right. Well, each week we will be bringing you extended interviews with lawmakers about issues that are important to them. We heard earlier from Senator Fort about education. We continue that conversation, beginning with transportation funding.
My general impressions are these, that the House bill just shifts the cost burden from the state to the local governments. It's just like what the Republicans have done with education, shifting the cost, putting the burden on the locals. And that's something that I know I've heard that the city governments and county governments have a great deal of concern about. And as far as transit is concerned, $100 million, one-time shot to almost 130 transit systems is not enough. You may remember a few months ago, they were talking about half of the $1 billion per year going to transit. Now we're talking about an average of less than $1 million going to 130 transit systems one time. That's not supporting transit. That's a relative pittance to what our needs are in the state regarding transportation and transit, buses and rail and different forms of transit.
How does this affect the ability of Georgia to attract business, do you think?
Well, unfortunately, this crowd in the last 12 years has put Georgia 25 years behind Florida and North Carolina, who invested in transit, who invested in transportation. The lack of action has put us in the position of trying to catch up, where places like Charlotte and Northern California and other areas of the country have gotten way ahead of us. We need to do something, but it needs to be done the right way, and transit needs to be high on the list of options. In the Senate, at least, Republicans are discussing it. They know it's the right thing to do. Unfortunately, they've painted themselves into a ideological corner. Their Tea Party wing hates the president, hates the Affordable Care Act, is doing everything they can to dismantle it. At the same time, Georgia's losing out on billions, not millions, tens of billions of dollars this year and next year because they won't do Medicaid expansion. But the worst thing is not just that we're losing money, but 3,000 people died last year, 3,000 people will die this year because Nathan Deal decided not to do Medicaid expansion. The Republicans know they're wrong. They've got an ad hoc committee in the Senate, at least, of Republicans working on this to see what the best way would be to do Medicaid expansion. There's an Arkansas model, there's a Tennessee model. They're not what I would like, but they're better than nothing. The people of Georgia deserve the 650,000 Georgians who are going without health care, who would get health care if Medicaid expansion was done. They deserve it, and it ought to get done. It ought to get done this year. I'm not sure it's going to get done this year, maybe in sometime soon. We're not going to roll over. We have a role to play as the loyal opposition. We have a role and a right to say what we feel and to do whatever we can to make sure that Medicaid expansion, education, and transportation are done the right way. This crowd has been in power for 12 years, and like I said, in 12 years they put us 25 years behind, and that's why what we do as Democrats is important.
And again, we will hear more from the Democrats on their education proposals next week. That's it, Bill.
All right, Pat, thanks so much. Stay with us as we finish up the show tonight, please. Leo, let me go right to you. Vincent Fort had a lot to say about Republican proposals. Of course, he talked again about Medicaid and the fact the governor ought to be taking the federal money. And he says, I don't know whether we're going to get to that this session. Is there any reason to think that's going to come up this session in any way that it could possibly go someplace?
I'm actually a little taken aback by his discussion of these subjects because I don't see any focus. I don't see any vision. I don't see anything other than what he ended his conversation with, and that is, we must provide opposition just so that there be opposition.
Well, but that is a point, Liz.
Yeah.
That, you know, the likelihood that they're going to really debate in any positive way Medicaid is low. But isn't it the role of you Democrats to continue to talk about this?
That's right, and we represent over 3 million Georgians, so we have to carry their voice to the Capitol, and certainly the minority party, when the Republicans were in that situation, had to do the same thing. You provide an alternative to whatever the majority party is laying out as a platform.
Greg, let me get you into this. It's interesting to think that Pat had Vincent Fort say, talking about the fact they're going to introduce an entire counter proposal on education. Is that surprising to you at all?
I think they want another option out there to show the voters what their perspective is. But I think Democrats also know they can influence the governor's proposal as well, because just like we've been saying, they can play the decisive role in not only the education but also the transportation debate, because Republicans are going to be lucky to hold the majority of their caucus, and they'll need Democratic support to pass both those issues.
Pat, that's an interesting question. I mean, Vincent Fort is really a strong partisan, but he knows that the governor's going to need Democrats come down the line. Maybe that's one of the reasons he's taking such a hard line on some of these issues.
Oh, it definitely is. And when we talked with Stacey Abrams earlier as well, she's kind of said the same thing. She said, you know, not that we're in the catbird seat, but they need us.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks to all of you for being with us tonight. Liz Flowers, Greg Bluestein, Leo Smith. As we leave you tonight, the issue of immigration is a hot button topic in Georgia and other states. But on the House floor today, Representative Bill Werkheiser took time to recognize legal immigrants who have made great sacrifices to come to America. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Many of them came from countries under persecution and had to leave everything behind. This group is represented today. We've got about 15 administrators, but the group actually is the Coalition of Refugees, which has over 180 members. And so today in the gallery we have 12 of those administrators and about 30 of the kids, which I'll mention in just a second. Well, the kids, they are on a soccer team, and not only have they excelled on the soccer field, their test scores are some of the highest in the state. And in speaking of giving, on the south wing or south steps, there will be having refreshments for those that want to come by at 1 o'clock. And just want to leave you with this challenge. When you see those, and they'll stand up with the red bags, just challenge you to ask them their story, because they've got some pretty incredible stories. So with that, would you help me welcome to the People's House the Coalition of Refugees? Would y'all please stand?
That's Representative Bill Werkheiser on the floor of the Georgia House today, speaking from the well. So again, we say goodnight for another evening of the Lawmakers. Pat St. Clair, it's so good to have you here in the studio tonight. Leo Smith again, Liz Flowers, thank you, and Greg Bluestein, pleasure to have you all here. Day 14 of the 2015 legislative session is now over. We'll be back here tomorrow night with the latest news from the Gold Dome, including the perennial push for pari-mutuel wagering in Georgia. That bill's back again, and there are some who think it may have a chance of passing this year. In the meantime, stay in touch with us on social media or email us at lawmakers@gpb.org. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Have a great evening.
This is a GPB original production.